Roman Britain was the territory that became the Roman province of Britannia following Rome's conquest of the island. It encompassed most of what is now England and Wales, remaining under Roman rule for nearly 4 centuries, from 43 AD to 410 AD. Yet the story of Roman Britain does not begin with the official invasion of Emperor Claudius. It begins almost a century earlier, when the rising power of Rome first turned its gaze toward the mysterious lands across the narrow sea, a place known to the Romans only through rumor and traders' tales. In 55 BC, during the height of the Gallic Wars, Julius Caesar led the first Roman expeditions to Britain. His campaigns were brief and limited in scope, yet they opened a new frontier in Rome's imagination. Britain, rich in resources and inhabited by tribal societies with ties to Gaul, stood as both an opportunity and a challenge to Roman ambition. Caesar's incursions in 55 and 54 BC were more demonstrations of power than attempts at conquest, but they marked the island's first recorded encounter with the empire that would one day reshape it. For almost 100 years after Caesar's departure, Britain remained outside Rome's direct control, a world of independent Celtic kingdoms and shifting alliances. Still, trade, diplomacy, and occasional conflict tied it increasingly to Rome's expanding sphere of influence. By the 1st century AD, as the empire consolidated its power across continental Europe, the conquest of Britain became both a political opportunity and a statement of imperial reach. When the legions of Emperor Claudius landed on Britain's shores in AD 43, they began a process that would transform the island's landscape, economy, and culture. Towns, roads, villas, and fortresses would rise where tribal settlements once stood. A new administrative system would link Britain to the wider Roman world, and Latin inscriptions would appear in a land that had never known writing in its own tongue. But Roman Britain was not simply a story of conquest. It was a story of adaptation, of native resistance and cultural fusion, of prosperity and decay, and of an empire that stretched its reach to the very edge of the known world. This is the story of Roman Britain, from Caesar's first invasion in 55 BC to the final Roman withdrawal in AD 410, a 400-year chapter in which an island at the fringe of the empire became, for a time, part of Rome's vast and complex world. Long before the legions of Rome ever looked across the Channel, Britain stood apart from the continental world, an island on the edge of known geography inhabited by Celtic peoples whose origins lay deep in the Iron Age societies of northwestern Europe. To later Roman writers, this island seemed mysterious and remote, beyond the known world. Yet its peoples were neither isolated nor primitive. By the 1st century BC, they had developed stable tribal kingdoms, traded across the sea with Gaul, and maintained complex political systems that would shape how Rome approached them. Archaeology shows that by roughly the 8th century BC, local communities in Britain had entered the Iron Age, smelting and forging metal tools and weapons that gave rise to fortified hill settlements. These hill forts, such as Maiden Castle in Dorset or Danbury in Hampshire, were not castles in the later medieval sense, but communal centers of trade, defense, and ceremony. Populations were concentrated in fertile lowlands and river valleys, while upland zones were reserved for pasture and hunting. Society was organized along kinship lines. Tribes were ruled by warrior elites whose authority rested on both military power and religious sanction. Religion in pre-Roman Britain was strongly animistic. Nature itself, the rivers, groves, stones, and springs, was imbued with spirit. The class known as Druids served as priests, judges, and keepers of oral knowledge. Later Roman sources, especially Julius Caesar's Commentarii de Bello Gallico, would emphasize the Druids' influence in both Gaul and Britain, describing them as central to education and ritual sacrifice. While Caesar's account mixes observation with Roman interpretation, archaeology supports the existence of sacred enclosures and votive offerings, suggesting a deeply spiritual culture. By the late 2nd and early 1st centuries BC, contact between Britain and the continent intensified. Maritime trade brought wine, glassware, fine pottery, and coinage from Gaul, while Britain exported raw materials, tin from Cornwall, lead from Somerset, iron from the Weald, and grain from its southern plains. Some Belgic groups migrated into southern Britain during the 1st century BC, bringing with them new pottery styles, fortification methods, and possibly new languages or dialects. Their arrival produced cultural layering rather than outright displacement. Southern Britain thus presented a mosaic of related but distinct tribal polities, each with its own coinage, hierarchy, and allegiance networks. Among these, the Cativalani under their king Cunobelinus, later known in legend as Cymbeline, would emerge as dominant on the eve of the Roman conquest. Centered around modern St. Albans, Verulamium, their influence stretched toward the Thames and beyond, rivaling that of the Trinovants to the east. Such rivalries mirrored those across the Channel, where tribes constantly vied for power and traded alliances with the expanding Roman Republic. For most of the Mediterranean world, Britain lay on the map's misty periphery. Greek explorers of the 4th century BC, such as Pytheas of Massalia, had claimed to sail north to an island called Britannic, describing its people and their tin trade. Yet these early reports were regarded with skepticism in Rome. Only in the mid-1st century BC, when the Roman general Julius Caesar completed his conquest of Gaul, did the island re-enter Roman consciousness as both an opportunity and a challenge. By 57 BC, Caesar had subdued much of Gaul, but several Gallic tribes continued to receive assistance from their kin in Britain. Goods, hostages, and perhaps soldiers moved across the narrow channel. Material culture combined native and imported elements. Local artisans produced fine metalwork, including intricate torques and decorated scabbards, reflecting craftsmanship of high technical skill. Houses were typically circular, built of timber and thatch, arranged within enclosures that offered defense and status display. Roads, as Romans would define them, did not yet exist, but well-worn trackways linked tribal centers, trading posts, and sacred sites. Politically, Britain in 55 BC was a patchwork of at least 20 major tribes, each governed by chieftains or kings who derived legitimacy from lineage and divine favor. Warfare was frequent but localized, small-scale raids and contests for tribute rather than large-scale annihilation. Alliances shifted quickly, and power tended to coalesce under leaders who could command both military strength and trade wealth. The southern tribes' familiarity with Roman goods and coinage would make them early collaborators and later subjects of the empire. To the north and west, beyond the reach of continental influence, life remained more traditional. The Brigantes in northern England, the Ordovices and Silures in Wales, and the Caledonii in Scotland lived in more rugged landscapes, where hill forts and tribal autonomy persisted. These regions would later form the frontiers of Roman expansion and the zones of longest resistance. By the middle of the 1st century BC, the stage was set for confrontation. Rome, triumphant in Gaul, now looked toward Britain both for strategic advantage and for political prestige. For Caesar, invasion promised glory. For Britain, it heralded an era that would redefine its identity for nearly 4 centuries. When his ships assembled along the Gallic coast in the late summer of 55 BC, the islanders could scarcely imagine that their world, an intricate web of tribal loyalties, sacred groves, and hill forts, was about to encounter the disciplined legions of the greatest military power on earth. The story of Roman Britain begins here, at the threshold where myth meets history, and where the island beyond the known world first enters the written record of Rome. By the mid-1st century BC, the Roman Republic had expanded deep into Western Europe. Julius Caesar, governor of Gaul, had defeated a vast confederation of Gallic tribes and extended Roman control to the English Channel. Yet beyond that narrow sea lay a land still outside Rome's reach. The island of Britain, though known through rumor and limited trade, remained an unknown quantity, both geographically and politically. To Caesar, it represented a potential threat, a source of prestige, and an opportunity for intelligence gathering. In 56 BC, while subduing coastal tribes in Gaul, Caesar learned that several British tribes had aided their Gallic kin with supplies and possibly soldiers. This connection gave him a justification for intervention. His motives were not purely military. A successful campaign across the sea would enhance his standing in Rome, where political rivals watched his growing power with suspicion. A brief, spectacular venture into uncharted territory could serve as both strategic reconnaissance and propaganda. In late summer 55 BC, Caesar assembled an invasion force of about 2 legions, roughly 10,000 men, at the port of Portus Itius, likely near modern Boulogne. His fleet consisted of 80 transport ships escorted by a smaller number of war galleys. The venture faced immediate logistical difficulties. The Romans had limited knowledge of tides, wind patterns, and the British coastline. Nevertheless, in August 55 BC, Caesar set sail across the Channel, accompanied by scouts and interpreters. The Britons, forewarned of his approach, gathered on the cliffs near Dover. Seeing the high ground heavily defended, Caesar sailed northeast and made landfall on a flatter beach, probably near modern Walmer or Deal in Kent. There, his troops faced a determined enemy drawn up along the shore. The Romans, burdened by armor and uncertain footing in shallow water, initially struggled to land. Caesar's warships provided covering fire with catapults and slings, and the legionaries, urged on by their standards, waded ashore. After a brief but fierce clash, the Britons withdrew inland. The landing was costly but tactically successful, yet the expedition soon faltered. Storms in the Channel wrecked many of Caesar's transport ships, leaving him stranded with limited supplies and no cavalry. The local tribes, emboldened by his predicament, harassed Roman foraging parties. Caesar counterattacked efficiently, securing temporary alliances and hostages from several chieftains. But with the onset of autumn, worsening weather, and damaged ships, he recognized that further advance was impractical. After 3 weeks in Britain, Caesar re-embarked his army and returned to Gaul. His first expedition achieved little in territorial terms, but it carried immense symbolic value. He had crossed what the Romans regarded as the edge of the world. The Senate celebrated the venture, voting him 20 days of public thanksgiving. Caesar himself gained intelligence about British tribes, geography, and defenses, information he intended to use the following year. Determined to complete what he had begun, Caesar organized a second invasion in 54 BC. This time, he prepared on a larger scale, 5 legions and 2,000 cavalry, totaling nearly 30,000 troops, supported by over 800 ships. The logistical challenge was immense, but demonstrated the Republic's capacity for maritime coordination. The fleet crossed under favorable weather and landed once again along the Kent coast, unopposed this time. The British tribes had withdrawn, adopting a strategy of mobility and attrition rather than confrontation. Caesar advanced inland, encountering organized resistance led by Cassivellaunus, king of the Catavellani, whose territory lay north of the Thames. Cassivellaunus united several tribes under his command, forming a loose coalition aimed at harassing the Roman invaders. Caesar's army moved systematically, constructing fortified camps each night. Skirmishes were frequent, but Roman discipline prevailed. After crossing the Thames River at a defended ford, likely near modern Brentford, Caesar launched an offensive into Cassivellaunus' heartland. With the onset of autumn and reports of unrest in Gaul, Caesar withdrew once again, taking his legions back across the Channel. The expeditions of 55 and 54 BC did not result in conquest. No Roman garrisons were left behind, no provinces created. Yet politically, the ventures were a triumph. They extended Caesar's reputation across the Republic and established Britain within the Roman worldview. The Senate minted coins commemorating the event, and maps of the empire were redrawn to include Britannia. For Britain itself, the encounters marked the beginning of recorded history. Over the next decades, Rome maintained diplomatic and commercial contact, supporting friendly rulers and exchanging embassies. The use of Roman-style coinage, sometimes bearing Latin inscriptions, expanded across the southeast. The names of tribal kings, Commius, Tincommius, Appius, and Verica, appeared on coins struck in the decades around 20 BC to AD 40, reflecting growing Roman influence. Rome, however, turned its attention elsewhere. Following Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, the Republic descended into civil war, and the new imperial government under Augustus preferred stability over risky conquest. Augustus considered invading Britain around 26 BC and again in 19 BC, but unfavorable conditions and the island's limited economic value deterred him. Instead, diplomatic and trade relations continued through client kingships. Britain thus remained nominally independent, but increasingly tied to Rome's economic and political sphere. The Atrebates, Regnances, and Trinovants benefited most from this relationship, importing luxury goods and adopting Roman administrative customs. Meanwhile, Western and Northern tribes, such as the Silures, Ordovices, and Brigantes, remained outside direct Roman contact, preserving traditional lifeways. The memory of Caesar's landings lingered in Roman consciousness. Poets and geographers referred to Britain as a half-tamed frontier awaiting subjugation. By the time of Emperor Claudius, nearly a century later, the groundwork laid by Caesar's reconnaissance made renewed conquest feasible. The island's resources, particularly metals and grain, were known, its tribes mapped, and its southern rulers already partially aligned with Rome. Caesar's expeditions thus represent a prologue to the Roman occupation that would begin in 43 AD. They transformed Britain from a peripheral myth into a defined objective of imperial policy. Though the legions had only briefly set foot on its shores, Rome had already begun to reshape the island's destiny through diplomacy, trade, and the promise of eventual domination. In the years that followed, Roman influence would ebb and flow, but the idea of Britain as part of Rome's natural sphere of expansion would persist, an idea finally realized under Claudius. When his legions crossed the Channel almost a century later, they were completing a process Julius Caesar had begun, turning a mysterious island beyond the known world into a province of the empire. Nearly a century after Caesar's brief expeditions, Britain remained outside Roman control, yet it was no longer a remote island. By the early 1st century AD, regular trade linked its southern tribes to the empire. Wine, glassware, and fine pottery arrived in exchange for grain, cattle, and metals. Some kings adopted Latin inscriptions and Roman titles on their coins. The island had entered Rome's diplomatic orbit, a world defined not only by legions, but by economic leverage and client kingship. The immediate cause for renewed Roman intervention came from internal British politics. Around AD 40, Boudica, king of the Atrebates, a pro-Roman tribe in southeastern Britain, was overthrown by his northern rival Caratacus, prince of the Cativalani. Driven from his kingdom, Boudica fled across the Channel and appealed to Emperor Claudius for aid. The timing proved ideal. Claudius, newly enthroned after the assassination of Caligula in AD 41, sought military success to legitimize his rule. A conquest of Britain, a goal first envisioned by Caesar, promised prestige and a clear demonstration of imperial authority. In AD 43, Claudius ordered an invasion under Aulus Plautius, an experienced general. The force comprised roughly 40,000 men, for legions supported by auxiliaries and cavalry. The main legions were 2 Augusta, commanded by Vespasian, the future emperor, 9 Hispana, 14 Gemina, and XX Valeria Victrix. Transported in a fleet across the Channel, they landed at multiple points along the southeastern coast, probably near Richborough in Kent. The invasion met resistance, but also rapid success. The Britons, under Caratacus and his brother Tagadumnus, attempted to halt the Romans near the river Medway. The battle lasted 2 days, a hard-fought engagement that demonstrated Roman tactical discipline. The use of professional auxiliaries, particularly Batavian troops skilled in swimming rivers in full armor, allowed the legions to cross and outflank the defenders. Tagadumnus was killed, and Caratacus withdrew westward. A second engagement near the River Thames ended with another Roman victory. With southeastern resistance collapsing, Aulus Plautius paused and summoned Claudius to join the campaign for a symbolic conclusion. The emperor arrived with reinforcements, including war elephants, an extraordinary display meant to awe native tribes. Claudius entered Camulodunum, modern Colchester, without resistance, accepted the submission of several chieftains, and formally declared the island conquered. This event, recorded in AD 43, marked the beginning of Roman Britain. Claudius remained in the province for only 16 days before returning to Rome, where he celebrated a triumph. Meanwhile, Aulus Plautius became the first governor of Britannia, charged with organizing the new province, securing its frontiers, and integrating local rulers into Roman administration. Roman consolidation followed swiftly. A network of forts and roads began to spread from the southeastern coast toward the Thames Valley. Camulodunum was established as the first Roman colonia, a settlement for retired legionaries. From there, new routes connected to strategic centers like Londinium, London, and Verulamium, St. Albans. Londinium, though not initially a capital, soon became a major trading hub due to its position on the Thames. In the early 40s and 50s, Roman forces pushed west and north against resistant tribes. Vespasian's II Augusta advanced through southern England, subduing the Durotriges, Belgae, and Debunny, and reaching as far as Exeter and the borders of Wales. The 9 Hispana secured Lincolnshire and the east, while 14 Gemina and XX Valeria Victrix consolidated the Midlands. The Romans did not impose uniform rule immediately. Some tribal kingdoms retained nominal independence under client kings who pledged loyalty to Rome. The most famous was Cogidubnus, ruler of the Regnances, centered around Chichester, who bore the title Rex et Legatus Augusti, king and imperial representative. Such arrangements allowed a smoother transition and reduced the need for garrisons in pacified regions. Not all tribes submitted. Caratacus, survivor of the initial invasion, emerged as the symbol of native resistance. He rallied the Silures and Ordovices of Wales, using the region's rugged terrain to wage a prolonged guerrilla war. For nearly a decade, Roman governors struggled to suppress him. His knowledge of Roman tactics, learned during his earlier wars, allowed him to mount effective ambushes and delay the full conquest of the West. In AD 51, after a series of campaigns led by Publius Ostorius Scapula, Roman legions finally cornered Caratacus in the territory of the Ordovices, possibly near modern Caradoc in Shropshire. He positioned his troops on a steep hill behind a river, a strong defensive site. Yet the legions, disciplined and equipped with siege skills, stormed the position after fierce fighting. Caratacus fled north to the Brigantes, whose queen Cartimandua had allied with Rome. She betrayed him to the Romans, and he was taken captive. Caratacus was transported to Rome, where his dignified demeanor impressed the emperor and senate. According to Tacitus, his speech before Claudius, in which he questioned why the conquerors of the world sought to enslave those with nothing, earned him and his family clemency. His defeat marked the collapse of organized native resistance in the southeast and Midlands, though unrest would soon reemerge elsewhere. By the mid-1st century AD, the foundations of Roman Britain were secure. The province now extended from the southern coast to the Severn and Trent rivers. Urbanization began under Roman direction. Camulodunum served as the administrative capital, housing a temple to the deified Claudius and the provincial council, Concilium Provincii. Roman law, taxation, and infrastructure followed: roads, bathhouses, and public buildings that projected imperial identity. Roman culture spread most rapidly in the south and east, where economic integration was strongest. Native elites adopted Roman customs, language, and architecture to demonstrate loyalty and prestige. Villas began to appear in the countryside, combining local design with Mediterranean features, mosaics, hypocaust heating, and imported wares. Yet beneath this facade of cooperation, tensions simmered. The presence of occupying troops, the imposition of tribute, and the growing power of Roman settlers sowed resentment among the native population. By AD 59, the governorship passed to Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, an aggressive commander intent on subduing Wales, the last stronghold of Druidic resistance. He launched a campaign against the island of Mona, modern Anglesey, a spiritual and political center for the Druids. The attack was brutal. Tacitus records that Roman soldiers faced chanting priests and women dressed in black who cursed them from the shore. The legions cut them down and burned the sacred groves, striking at the heart of native religion. While Suetonius campaigned in the west, revolt ignited in the east, a rebellion that would nearly destroy Roman Britain. The cause lay in the treatment of the Iceni tribe and their queen, Boudica. Her uprising would become one of the most violent and consequential events in Britain's early history. By AD 60, Roman Britain appeared stable. The province was expanding west under Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, whose campaign against the Druids in Anglesey, Mona, sought to crush the island's last religious resistance. But while the legions burned sacred groves in Wales, disaster unfolded in the east. A native uprising erupted that nearly destroyed Rome's entire presence in Britain, a rebellion led by Boudica, queen of the Iceni. The Iceni occupied territory in what is now Norfolk and parts of Suffolk. They had initially cooperated with Rome, retaining semi-autonomy under their king, Prasutagus. As a client ruler, Prasutagus enjoyed local authority in exchange for loyalty and tribute to the empire. Yet upon his death around AD 60, he sought to secure his dynasty's future by making a will that named both the Roman emperor and his own family as heirs, a gesture of allegiance intended to preserve peace. The Romans ignored his wishes. Imperial agents treated the kingdom as forfeit property, seizing lands, confiscating estates, and enslaving members of the royal household. Prasutagus's widow, Boudica, protested. In response, Roman soldiers publicly flogged her and assaulted her daughters, an act that shattered any illusion of partnership. The humiliation of a royal woman and the abuse of her children became the spark for a massive anti-Roman revolt. Boudica's rage aligned with widespread resentment among neighboring tribes. The Roman administration had imposed heavy tribute, seized farmland for veteran colonies, and allowed Roman financiers to exploit native debtors. The temple of the deified Claudius at Camulodunum symbolized Roman arrogance, a colossal structure maintained at local expense, housing officials and settlers who looked down upon the Britons. The situation was ripe for insurrection. With Suetonius Paulinus far away in North Wales, the southeastern region was lightly defended. The governor's main forces, the 14 Gemina, XX Valeria Victrix, and detachments of 2 Augusta, were stationed far from the Iceni heartland. Boudica seized the moment. She united the Iceni, Trinovants, and other disaffected tribes in a common cause: expel the Romans and destroy their settlements. According to Tacitus, the combined rebel army numbered over 100,000. They chose Camulodunum, the provincial capital, as their first target. The city, occupied by Roman veterans and administrators, was poorly fortified, its walls unfinished, its defenses symbolic rather than military. As the rebels advanced, Roman officials appealed for reinforcements, but only a small detachment of 200 auxiliary troops could be dispatched. They were quickly overwhelmed. The Temple of Claudius, where the last defenders sought refuge, was besieged for 2 days before being stormed. The entire settlement was destroyed and its inhabitants massacred. Archaeological layers at modern Colchester reveal a thick deposit of ash and charred debris from this event, a silent witness to the devastation recorded by Roman historians. After Camulodunum's destruction, the rebels marched south toward Londinium. At the time, Londinium was not a colonia but a thriving mercantile hub, a symbol of Rome's economic power in Britain. Suetonius Paulinus, marching east after hearing of the rebellion, reached the city ahead of the rebels. Recognizing that he lacked sufficient troops to defend it, he made a grim decision. He ordered the evacuation of all who could flee and abandon Londinium to its fate. The rebels entered soon after. They slaughtered the remaining inhabitants and burned the city to the ground. Contemporary sources claim thousands perished. Modern excavations confirm a thick layer of red ash across the city's archaeological strata, physical evidence of the inferno that consumed Roman London in AD 60 or 61. Boudica's army then advanced northwest toward Verulamium, St. Albans, another Romanized town. It too was destroyed. Across southern Britain, symbols of Roman authority, temples, markets, villas were targeted. The violence was intense, and Roman sources, writing from an imperial perspective, describe atrocities against civilians. Yet to the Britons, this was not mere rebellion but retribution, vengeance for years of humiliation, exploitation, and occupation. Suetonius Paulinus regrouped his remaining forces, the 14 Gemina, elements of the XX Valeria Victrix, and auxiliary cohorts, totaling around 10,000 men. The 2 Augusta, stationed in the southwest under Poenius Postumus, failed to join, possibly out of fear or miscommunication. Despite being outnumbered nearly 10-1, Suetonius resolved to fight. His experience and discipline offered Rome its only chance of survival. He selected a defensive position along a narrow defile with dense woods at his rear, an unidentified site, possibly along Waddling Street. The terrain neutralized the enemy's numerical advantage by preventing encirclement. As the Britons assembled opposite him, Boudica delivered a fiery speech urging freedom over slavery. The Roman soldiers, silent and professional, formed ranks behind their scutus shields. When the Britons attacked, their mass charge met a wall of Roman javelins. The pilum volleys shattered momentum, embedding into shields and disorganizing the front ranks. Then the legions advanced in wedge formation, cutting through the enemy line with precision. Auxiliary cavalry pursued retreating groups, turning chaos into slaughter. Behind the battlefield, the rebels' baggage train, filled with families and wagons, blocked their escape. What began as an overwhelming uprising ended in annihilation. Ancient sources report catastrophic losses. Tacitus claims 80,000 Britons were killed compared to 400 Romans. Though likely exaggerated, the scale of destruction was immense. The rebellion was crushed. Boudica herself disappeared from the record. Dio Cassius writes that she took poison to avoid capture. Tacitus simply notes that she died soon after and was given a quiet burial. The suppression of the revolt marked a turning point. Roman Britain had nearly collapsed. 3 major cities were destroyed, tens of thousands were dead, and the provincial economy was devastated. The imperial government, alarmed by the near loss of an entire province, briefly considered withdrawal. Emperor Nero replaced Suetonius Paulinus with a more conciliatory governor, Publius Petronius Turpilianus, to restore order and rebuild trust. Reconstruction began quickly. Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium were rebuilt on a more secure Roman plan, with defensive walls and military oversight. Londinium emerged as the new provincial capital, reflecting its strategic and economic centrality. Temples and forums rose again, this time under stricter imperial control. Politically, the revolt reshaped Roman governance. The harsh financial practices that had provoked rebellion were moderated, and native elites were reintegrated into administration. The Iceni survived as a reduced client state, but never regained their former influence. The Roman army, meanwhile, learned valuable lessons in counterinsurgency and logistics, lessons that would underpin future expansion into the north and west. Boudica's rebellion became a defining legend in British history. To the Romans, she was a dangerous rebel. To later generations, a symbol of resistance. Her story, preserved by Tacitus and Dio Cassius, has endured as one of the most dramatic episodes of antiquity. Archaeology corroborates much of it. Widespread burn layers from Colchester, London, and St. Albans confirm the scale of the destruction. In the immediate aftermath, Roman authority reasserted itself. Roads were repaired, trade resumed, and new forts rose across the province. Yet the memory of Boudica's uprising haunted Roman administrators for decades. It revealed the volatility beneath the veneer of Romanization and the fragility of an empire built upon conquest rather than consent. By AD 61, Roman Britain had survived its greatest internal crisis. The province emerged scarred but stronger, its administration more cautious and its garrisons reinforced. From this point forward, Rome's ambitions turned northward, toward the mountains of Wales, the Pennines, and ultimately the distant frontier of Caledonia. The rebellion's ashes marked the beginning of a new phase, consolidation and expansion, a period in which the legions would fortify their hold and define the landscape of Roman Britain for the next 3 centuries. The aftermath of Boudica's revolt, AD 61, left Roman Britain wounded yet resolute. Once reconstruction began, the imperial government redirected its focus towards securing the frontiers and completing the subjugation of the island. From the reign of Nero, 54 to 68 AD, to Domitian, 81 to 96 AD, the Roman army systematically expanded its reach, first across Wales, then into northern England, and finally deep into Caledonia, modern Scotland. This era, spanning roughly 3 decades, transformed Britain from a fragile province into a structured and fortified component of the Roman Empire. In the immediate years after the revolt, Roman priorities centered on stability. The devastation of the southeast required massive rebuilding efforts. Cities like Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium were reconstructed, and new administrative frameworks were established. Publius Petronius Turpilianus, appointed governor in AD 61, adopted conciliatory policies, replacing coercion with diplomacy. Garrisons were strengthened, taxation rebalanced, and native aristocracies restored to limited power. Meanwhile, the Roman military presence was reorganized. The 14 Gemina, veterans of Boudica's campaign, were withdrawn to the continent, replaced by new legions such as 2 Adiatrix and later 2 Augusta, 9 Hispana, and XX Valeria Victrix. Their combined strength, around 20,000 legionaries plus auxiliaries, anchored Rome's long-term control. Under Emperor Vespasian, reigned 69 to 79 AD, a former commander in the conquest itself, Britain became a priority once more. Having risen to power during the year of the 4 emperors, AD 69, Vespasian viewed expansion as a means of consolidating imperial legitimacy. His reign ushered in the next great phase of Roman advance. Wales, or Cambria, had long resisted Roman domination. Its rugged terrain and fiercely independent tribes, the Silures, Ordovices, and Singly, made it one of the hardest regions to pacify. Earlier attempts by governors Ostorius Scapula and Suetonius Paulinus had achieved limited success. Permanent conquest required persistence, fortified networks, and mobility. Governor Sextus Julius Frontinus, AD 74–78, undertook this challenge with methodical precision. A skilled engineer and strategist, Frontinus employed both diplomacy and force. He constructed a chain of forts and roads across South Wales, linking key valleys and coastal routes. The Silures, who had famously resisted Romanization, were subdued through continuous campaigns and the establishment of legionary bases at Caerleon, Isca, and Chester, Deva. These bases served not only as military centers but also as logistical hubs, allowing rapid troop movement and supply flow. The network became the framework of Roman Wales, one that endured for centuries. By the late 70s, all major Welsh tribes had been subdued, and Rome's western frontier was secured. In AD 78, the governorship passed to Gnaeus Julius Agricola, one of the most capable Roman generals of the 1st century. His career and campaigns are preserved in Tacitus's Agricola, a biography written by his son-in-law. Under Agricola, Roman Britain reached its greatest territorial extent. Agricola's first task was to crush the Ordovices in North Wales, who had destroyed a Roman cavalry unit shortly before his arrival. He launched a swift punitive campaign, reportedly annihilating the tribe. With Wales pacified, Agricola began advancing north into Brigantian territory, northern England. The Brigantes, the largest tribe in Britain, had previously been ruled by Queen Cartimandua, an ally of Rome. But after internal revolt and her overthrow, parts of the tribe turned hostile. Agricola reasserted Roman authority by building forts and roads across Yorkshire and Lancashire, establishing Eboracum, York, as a strategic base for northern operations. By AD 79 to 80, Agricola pushed into southern Scotland, campaigning through the Clyde and Forth valleys. He built new forts at Inchtuthil, Newstead, and Camelon, forming a forward line of defense. His army's mobility, supported by a Roman fleet sailing along the coasts, allowed coordinated land and sea advances, an uncommon feat in Roman warfare. Beyond conquest, Agricola pursued integration. He introduced Roman-style education, encouraged town building, and trained local elites in Latin and administration. Tacitus records his efforts to civilize the Britons by introducing baths, temples, and forums, though the historian cynically notes that such measures disguise slavery as culture. Nevertheless, Agricola's policies accelerated the Romanization of the South and East, where local rulers increasingly identified with imperial norms. New urban centers like Corinium, Cirencesta, and Lindum, Lincoln, emerged as municipal hubs, while Londinium flourished as a commercial capital. The provincial economy prospered, exporting metals, grain, and slaves to the continent. Roman villas multiplied across the countryside, signaling both wealth and cultural assimilation among the elite. Having secured Britain south of the Forth, Clyde Line, Agricola embarked on his most ambitious campaign, the conquest of Caledonia. The region, inhabited by fierce tribes collectively labeled the Caledonii, presented a formidable challenge: mountainous terrain, limited roads, and a warlike population skilled in guerrilla tactics. In AD 81 to 83, Agricola's forces advanced along the eastern coast, supported by the fleet. He built a chain of forts at strategic points, each one a day's march apart, creating a corridor of Roman control. According to Tacitus, these outposts extended nearly to the Moray Firth, far beyond any previous Roman frontier. The climax came in AD 83 or 84, when Agricola faced a massive Caledonian army under Calgacus at the Battle of Mons Graupius. The exact location remains debated, possibly Benahi or Grampian Mountains, but the engagement stands as one of the northernmost recorded battles of Roman history. Tacitus claims the Caledonians numbered 30,000, facing about 17,000 Romans. Using superior discipline and tactics, Agricola's troops routed the enemy, inflicting heavy casualties while sustaining minimal losses. Calgacus escaped, and the organized resistance collapsed. Despite victory, Agricola's gains proved temporary. In AD 85, he was recalled to Rome, possibly due to Emperor Domitian's jealousy of his growing fame. Subsequent governors lacked resources to maintain distant Caledonian forts, and by AD 90, Roman forces withdrew south to the Stanigate line, stretching between Carlisle and Corbridge. This became the effective northern frontier for several decades. Even so, Agricola's campaigns left enduring marks. His network of roads, forts, and settlements defined Roman presence in the north and laid the groundwork for later frontier defenses such as Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall. His governance also represented the height of military and administrative ambition in Roman Britain, a fusion of conquest, assimilation, and strategic consolidation. By the end of the 1st century AD, Britain had matured into a functioning Roman province. The legions were stationed in permanent fortresses, 2 Augusta at Caerleon, 9 Hispana at York, and XX Valeria Victrix at Chester. Around them grew civilian settlements, Canabi, the seeds of future Roman towns. Trade flowed freely through ports like Londinium, Richborough, and Chichester, connecting Britain with Gaul, Spain, and the Mediterranean. Roman administration emphasized taxation, law, and infrastructure. Native aristocrats served as local magistrates, decuriones, integrating into the imperial system. Latin inscriptions, coinage, and sculpture flourished. Temples honored both Roman and Celtic deities, reflecting cultural fusion rather than eradication. Peace, however, was relative. The Brigantes and northern tribes occasionally rebelled, testing Roman vigilance. But overall, the province entered a rare period of stability, one that would last through the reigns of Trajan and Hadrian in the 2nd century. The years 61 to 96 AD shaped the very structure of Roman Britain. Military victory had transformed into occupation. Conquest had evolved into administration. Roman authority now extended from the southern coast to the Scottish lowlands, its power embodied in roads, fortresses, and cities. Agricola's campaigns represented the final great push of expansion, the moment when Rome nearly subdued the entire island. Yet the retreat that followed revealed an enduring truth. Britain, while valuable, was a frontier too distant and costly to hold in full. From this point onward, Roman strategy would shift from conquest to consolidation, defining, defending, and preserving its boundaries rather than extending them further. In the aftermath of the Boudican revolt, Roman Britain entered a crucial period of consolidation and reconstruction. The rebellion had nearly erased the progress of conquest, and Rome faced the task of rebuilding not only cities, but also the trust of the conquered. From 61 AD to the early 2nd century, The Romans transformed Britain from a patchwork of subdued tribes into a stable province within the Roman Empire. It was a time of recovery, urban planning, military expansion, and gradual integration, the true making of Roman Britain. After Boudica's defeat in 61 AD, the governor Publius Petronius Turpilianus focused on pacification rather than conquest. His approach was cautious and diplomatic. Garrisons were reinforced, but the emphasis shifted toward infrastructure and restoring order. The province's administration was reorganized, and punitive actions against the tribes were replaced with a policy of Romanization through cooperation. When Marcus Trebellius Maximus succeeded him around 63 AD, Britain saw its first sustained peace since the invasion. Trebellius avoided military campaigns and instead concentrated on economic development and rebuilding cities destroyed during the revolt, notably Camulodunum, Colchester, Londinium, London, and Verulamium, St. Albans. These towns were reconstructed as planned Roman settlements, featuring grids of streets, forums, temples, and baths. Londinium, with its strategic location on the Thames, emerged as the provincial capital and commercial hub. However, peace did not mean complete submission. The Roman army still maintained a strong presence, especially in Wales and northern Britain. Garrisons ensured that the tribes remained loyal, and forts evolved into permanent military bases connected by a growing network of roads. The relative calm ended in 69 AD, when the year of the four emperors plunged the empire into civil war. In Britain, the legions remained loyal to the governor Marcus Vettius Bolanus, avoiding the internal chaos that consumed Rome. Yet the instability delayed expansion northward. When Quintus Petilius Cerealis became governor in 71 AD under Emperor Vespasian, Roman ambitions in Britain revived. Cerealis, a seasoned commander, launched new campaigns against the Brigantes, the powerful tribe controlling much of northern England. Agricola's most famous campaign occurred in 83 AD, culminating in the Battle of Mons Graupius, possibly near modern Scotland's Grampian Mountains. Roman sources, primarily Tacitus, describe a decisive victory against the Caledonian tribes led by Calgicus. Although Tacitus's account likely exaggerates the scale of triumph, it symbolized the furthest reach of Roman arms in Britain. Despite Agricola's success, the advance into Caledonia was unsustainable. The region's terrain, climate, and resistance made permanent occupation costly. Elsewhere, towns such as Camulodunum, Verulamium, Corinium, Cirencesta, and Ventus Solurum, Caerwent, emerged as centers of trade and governance. Many began as tribal capitals, but were reshaped into Roman-style municipalities, civitates, governed by local elites loyal to Rome. Roman authorities encouraged the British aristocracy to adopt Roman customs, language, and dress. Sons of tribal leaders received an education in Latin and were often granted Roman citizenship. Over time, these local elites formed a bridge between Roman officials and native populations. In return, Britain exported raw materials: tin from Cornwall, lead from the Mendip Hills, iron from the Weald, and grain from the fertile lands of the southeast. Archaeological evidence from villa estates indicates a steady increase in agricultural productivity. Wealthy landowners adopted Roman-style villas with mosaic floors, hypocaust heating, and bathhouses. These estates became the backbone of rural life, producing food for local markets and the army. Taxation funded public works, roads, aqueducts, and temples, while surplus wealth reinforced the local elite's loyalty to Roman rule. The economic integration of Britain into the imperial system represented one of Rome's most lasting achievements. Religion also reflected the blending of Roman and Celtic traditions. Temples dedicated to Roman gods stood beside local shrines to native deities. In many cases, the two merged. Mars was worshipped as Mars Cassidius, and Sulis, a Celtic goddess of healing, became Sulis Minerva at Bath. This syncretism eased cultural tensions and allowed Roman and native practices to coexist. The city of Aquae Sulis, Bath, became a major religious center, drawing pilgrims from across the province. Its grand bath complex and temple demonstrated the wealth and engineering skill of the Roman world. By the early 2nd century, Latin inscriptions appeared widely across the province, from milestones and dedications to official decrees. The spread of written Latin signified not only administrative control, but also cultural transformation. Administratively, Britain was divided into territories corresponding to major tribal regions. These were grouped into civitates, semi-autonomous city-states governed by local councils, Ordo Decurianum. Over them stood the governor, Legatus Augusti pro praetor, who commanded the legions and represented imperial authority. Beneath him, a financial officer, procurator, managed taxation and state revenues. The governor's power was immense, both civil and military, and his residence at Londinium or later Eboracum functioned as the nerve center of Roman Britain. Justice followed Roman law, though local customs persisted in rural areas. Over time, Roman citizenship expanded, granting legal rights to more inhabitants, culminating later in the Constitutio Annunniana, 212 AD, which extended citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. By 122 AD, Britain had become a stable and productive province, though its northern frontier remained unsettled. The Romans had subdued most tribes, introduced their system of governance, and established cities, roads, and trade networks that transformed the landscape. The next great shift came with the arrival of Emperor Hadrian in 122 AD. Assessing the difficulties of maintaining far-flung conquests, Hadrian ordered the construction of a defensive barrier across northern Britain, a monumental wall marking the empire's new frontier. This marked the end of Britain's formative phase and the beginning of its mature provincial period, a land fully integrated into the Roman world, yet forever shaped by its own geography and resilient native spirit. By the early 2nd century AD, Rome's reach in Britain extended far beyond the expectations of Julius Caesar or Claudius. The province had become one of the empire's most stable western outposts, producing wealth and grain, exporting metals, and adopting Roman law and culture. Yet beyond its northernmost settlements lay a vast, untamed land, Caledonia, inhabited by tribes Rome had never fully conquered. Frequent skirmishes and the cost of maintaining far-flung garrisons convinced Emperor Hadrian that the time had come to define the limits of Roman power in Britain. When Emperor Hadrian arrived in Britain in 122 AD, the empire was undergoing a shift in philosophy. The era of aggressive conquest under emperors like Trajan was ending. Hadrian's reign focused instead on consolidation, strengthening borders rather than expanding them. Across the empire, he ordered the construction of walls, forts, and boundaries designed to secure the Roman world against external threats. In Britain, this new defensive strategy took its most monumental form, Hadrian's Wall. Ancient sources, Notably, the Historia Augusta record that Hadrian was the first to build a wall 80 miles long to separate the Romans from the barbarians. While the number is slightly exaggerated, the wall stretched roughly 73 Roman miles, about 117 kilometers, from Bonus on Solway in the west to Wallsend on Tyne in the east, cutting across the rugged northern landscape. Construction began around 122 AD, led by the three legions stationed in Britain, the 2nd Augusta, 2 Augusta, the 6th Victrix, 6 Victrix, and the 20th Valeria Victrix, XX Valeria Victrix. The workforce, numbering tens of thousands of soldiers, engineers, and laborers, completed the main structure over 6 years. The wall itself was a massive engineering achievement. In the east, where stone was abundant, it was built from squared blocks of local limestone, about 3 meters wide and up to 6 meters high. In the west, where stone was scarce, it began as a turf rampart before later being replaced by stone. At intervals of approximately every mile, 1.6 kilometers, stood a mile castle, a small fort housing a garrison of around 20 to 30 men. Between each pair of mile castles were 2 turrets, observation towers that allowed constant surveillance of the frontier. Larger forts were placed every 7 to 8 miles, each capable of holding hundreds of troops and cavalry. Behind the wall ran a military road, allowing rapid movement of troops and supplies. To the south was the Vallum, a deep ditch flanked by mounds, marking the military zone that separated soldiers from civilians. The wall was more than a defensive barrier. It symbolized Roman control, a statement of imperial authority etched into the landscape. It marked not only the northernmost boundary of the empire, but also the psychological frontier between civilization and wilderness. Life along Hadrian's wall was harsh but organized. Soldiers stationed in forts like Housesteads, Vercovicium, Burdoswald, Banna, and Vindolanda lived in close-knit communities. Archaeological discoveries from Vindolanda, including the famous wooden writing tablets, offer a vivid picture of everyday life. Letters, supply lists, personal notes, and official orders preserved by the damp soil. These records reveal an empire sustained by routine. Soldiers requested warm clothing, complained about shortages, and wrote to their families. One tablet famously contains an invitation to a birthday party, the earliest known written example of such in Britain, showing that even on the cold edge of the empire, life had moments of ordinary human connection. The walled garrisons were not composed solely of Italians. The Roman army in Britain was largely auxiliary, made up of non-citizen troops from across the empire. Units stationed on the wall came from as far away as Syria, Spain, Germany, and North Africa. The cohors Aelia Decorum from the Balkans, cohors II Astrum from northern Spain, and cohors I Tungrorum from Belgium are among those recorded. These soldiers served for 25 years before earning Roman citizenship. Many settled locally after retirement, marrying native women and establishing small communities near the forts. Over time, a cosmopolitan society emerged, blending Roman and native traditions across the northern frontier. North of Hadrian's wall lay a patchwork of tribal groups, often collectively referred to as Caledonians by Roman writers. They were not a unified people, but a network of independent tribes living in fortified hilltop settlements. They practiced agriculture, herding, and small-scale trade, but also engaged in raiding Roman territory. Rome's relationship with these tribes fluctuated between trade, diplomacy, and conflict. At times, the wall served as a controlled frontier, allowing regulated crossings for commerce or tribute. At others, it became a militarized line separating two hostile worlds. Roman patrols frequently ventured beyond the wall, maintaining forward outposts and temporary camps as far as the Antonine frontier in southern Scotland. But the dense forests, bogs, and mountains of the north made permanent occupation impractical. Despite Hadrian's policy of consolidation, his successor, Emperor Antoninus Pius, decided to push the boundary farther north around 142 AD. The governor Quintus Lollius Urbicus led this campaign, establishing a new defensive line, the Antonine Wall, stretching about 39 miles, 63 kilometers, between the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde. The Antonine Wall was shorter but built primarily of turf, with stone forts and a deep ditch along its length. It represented a renewed attempt to bring the lowlands of Scotland under firmer Roman control. Forts such as Rough Castle, Bar Hill, and Caradon served as garrisons, while new roads connected the line to the south. However, maintaining two walls and an extended frontier proved unsustainable. Frequent revolts and logistical strain forced Rome to abandon the Antonine Wall by around 162 AD, retreating once more to Hadrian's Wall, which remained the permanent northern frontier for the next 2 centuries. By the mid-2nd century, Hadrian's Wall stood not only as a defensive barrier, but as a lasting symbol of Roman order. It divided two worlds, the settled, Romanized south and the tribal, untamed north. It also defined the identity of Roman Britain itself. Behind its fortifications lay a network of towns, roads, and farms that thrived under the protection of the legions. South of the wall, cities such as Eboracum, York, and Corbridge, Coria, developed into administrative and commercial centers. Eboracum became a legionary headquarters and the provincial capital of northern Britain, known as Britannia Inferior after the division of the province in the early 3rd century. The wall's forts became centers of mixed communities. Civilian settlements, vicus, grew outside military installations, housing merchants, artisans, and families of soldiers. Trade flourished, leather goods, pottery, and grain moved northward. Hides, metals, and livestock came south. Even in times of peace, the wall remained active. Its soldiers repaired structures, patrolled the frontier, and maintained the Roman presence that defined Britain's northern edge. Hadrian's Wall endured for nearly 3 centuries, a living monument to Roman engineering and imperial endurance. It was rebuilt, repaired, and refortified repeatedly, surviving long after other frontiers of the empire had fallen into neglect. Its legacy extended beyond military history. It shaped the geography and psychology of northern Britain, influencing settlement patterns and later medieval boundaries. Even after the Roman withdrawal, its line remained embedded in the landscape, a visible memory of Rome's reach. By around 150 AD, Roman Britain was at its height, secure behind its wall, economically vibrant, and culturally Romanized. Yet beneath this apparent stability, challenges lingered. The frontier would hold, but only for a time. Over the next century, new pressures, internal revolts, foreign invasions, and economic strain would begin to test the strength of Roman Britain's foundations. By the middle of the 2nd century AD, Roman Britain had entered its most stable and prosperous era. The legions guarded a clearly defined frontier along Hadrian's Wall. The southern towns flourished with trade and agriculture. and the province's population had become increasingly Romanized. For roughly a century, Britain lived under the rhythm of the Roman world. Its roads, laws, architecture, and economy shaping daily existence from the bustling streets of Londinium to the quiet villas of the countryside. This period, from around 150 to 250 AD, represents the height of Roman civilization in Britain. Roman Britain was not a uniform landscape, but a mosaic of contrasts. The south and east were heavily urbanized and economically integrated into the empire, while the north and west remained more rural and militarized. The south, particularly around Londinium, Verulamium, and Corinium, mirrored the life of Gaulish or Italian provinces, stone houses, marketplaces, and baths. The north, stretching toward Eboracum, York, and the Wall, retained a more rugged character. Garrison towns grew beside forts, hosting markets and workshops that catered to soldiers. The western regions of Wales and the northern highlands remained less influenced by Roman culture, though even there, trade in Roman goods were common. By this time, Britain had an estimated population of 2 to 3 million people, most of whom were rural farmers living in small settlements. The Roman presence was strongest in towns, along military routes, and around villa estates. Roman towns, known as civitates, served as administrative, religious, and economic centers. They typically followed a grid plan, with paved streets, central forums, and temples. The most prominent towns included Londinium, Camulodunum, Colchester, Verulamium, St. Albans, Corinium, Cirencesta, and Vinta Belgarum, Winchester. Londinium remained the commercial capital, with a thriving port on the Thames that connected Britain to Gaul and the wider empire. Its population may have exceeded 30,000, a large city by Roman provincial standards. Archaeological finds show warehouses, workshops, and merchant houses filled with imported goods, wine from Gaul, olive oil from Spain, and fine Samian pottery from Gaul and Germany. Municipal government followed the Roman model. Each town had a local council, Ordo Decurionum, elected magistrates, and public buildings funded by wealthy citizens. Civic duty was both an honor and an obligation. Local elites financed temples, theaters, and bathhouses as acts of status and loyalty to Rome. Bathing culture was integral to Roman life. Public baths, such as those at Bath, Aquae Sulis, Wroxeter, Viraconium, and Lincoln, were social as well as hygienic centers, places to exercise, discuss business, or relax. Religion, leisure, and daily life are intertwined. Beyond the towns, the countryside of southern Britain transformed under Roman influence. Large estates, or villas, became symbols of wealth and cultural assimilation. These were not merely homes, but economic centers, managing farms, workshops, and laborers. The earliest villas began as modest farmhouses in the 1st century, but by the mid-2nd century, many evolved into elaborate complexes with mosaic floors, heated hypocaust systems, porticos, and private bath suites. Famous examples include the villas at Fishbourne, Chedworth, and Lullingstone. These estates produced grain, meat, wool, and pottery for local use and export. The Roman army in the north provided a constant market for supplies, linking rural production to military needs. The use of coinage spread even into rural areas, and Roman-style tools and pottery became common across the south. For most Britons, however, life remained modest. The majority of the population lived in small farmsteads built from timber and thatch. They practiced mixed farming, growing wheat, barley, and oats while raising cattle, sheep, and pigs. Roman technology improved productivity, but daily life for most rural people remained tied to the land and the seasons. The Roman army remained the backbone of the province. Around 40,000 troops, including 3 legions and numerous auxiliary cohorts, were stationed in Britain during the 2nd century. The 6th Legion Victrix was based at Eboracum, the 20th Valeria Victrix at Deva, Chester, and the 2nd Augusta at Isca Celurum, Caerleon. Forts and outposts dotted the landscape from Wales to Northumberland. Along Hadrian's Wall, the garrisons maintained constant vigilance. Though large-scale invasions were rare, the frontier required continuous patrols and repairs. The army's influence extended beyond defense. It built roads, bridges, and towns, maintained order, and facilitated trade. Veterans often settled nearby, integrating into local communities and contributing to Romanization. Their pensions and skills helped spread Roman customs deep into the countryside. Eboracum, the headquarters of the Northern Legions, evolved into one of the most important military and administrative centers in the Western Empire. Emperors Hadrian, 122 AD, and later Septimius Severus, around 208 AD, both visited the city. Severus would eventually die there in 211 AD during a campaign to reassert control over northern tribes, a testament to York's enduring strategic importance. Britain's economy in this period was prosperous and well integrated into imperial trade networks. Roman Britain exported metals, particularly lead from Somerset, iron from the Weald, tin from Cornwall, and silver from Wales, alongside agricultural goods like grain and wool. Coin finds from this era show an active monetary economy. Markets existed in most towns, where artisans and merchants sold tools, glassware, jewelry, and imported goods. Amphory found in Britain indicates steady trade with Gaul, Spain, and the Mediterranean. The Roman road system was vital to this economic life. Major routes, Watling Street, Ermine Street, and Fosse Way, connected ports, forts, and urban centers. These roads allowed the movement of soldiers, merchants, and goods with efficiency unprecedented in pre-Roman Britain. By the 2nd century, Roman religion had become deeply woven into provincial life. The pantheon of gods, Jupiter, Mars, Mercury, Venus, and Minerva, was worshipped alongside native Celtic deities. This blending of faiths created a unique Romano-British spirituality. Temples stood across the province, to Sulis Minerva at Bath, Mars Nodens at Lydney, and Jupiter Dolichinas at Caroburg. The imperial cult, worship of the emperor as a divine figure, symbolized loyalty to Rome. Religious inscriptions from this period reveal dedications by soldiers, merchants, and civilians alike. Mystery religions, including the cult of Mithras, also spread among the army and urban elite. Mithraea, underground temples dedicated to the god Mithras, have been found at Londinium, Eboracum, and Hadrian's Wall. By the late 2nd century, Christianity had likely reached Britain, though its presence remained small and localized. Early evidence, such as Christian symbols and later writings, suggests isolated communities existed by the early 3rd century. Administratively, Britain remained a single province until around 197 AD, when Emperor Septimius Severus divided it into Britannia Superior, southern Britain, governed from Londinium, and Britannia Inferior, northern Britain, governed from Eboracum. This division reduced the power of provincial governors and improved military oversight. Each province had its own governor, financial procurator, and council. Roman law governed urban centers and military zones, while local customs persisted in rural areas. Public order was maintained by the military and local magistrates. Roman justice, though formalized, could be harsh, involving corporal punishment, fines, or exile. Yet it brought predictability and administrative coherence to the province. Roman Britain's cultural life blended Mediterranean and Celtic influences. Latin became the language of government and trade, though native languages persisted in rural areas. Inscriptions, milestones, and tombstones show widespread literacy among soldiers and officials. Art and craftsmanship flourished. Mosaic floors, frescoes, and metalwork display a high degree of skill. Pottery industries developed at Alice Holt, Nene Valley, and Colchester, producing both fine wares and utilitarian goods. Clothing, diet, and architecture reflected the fusion of Roman and local traditions. Bread, wine, olive oil, and fish sauce became common in wealthier households, while rural people continued to rely on native grains and meats. Entertainment included theaters, amphitheaters, and games. Amphitheaters at Caerleon, Chester, and Silchester hosted spectacles ranging from gladiatorial contests to public ceremonies. Roman Britain, though far from Rome, shared in the empire's social rhythms. By around 200 AD, Roman Britain appeared secure and prosperous. But under the surface, strains were emerging. The army remained expensive to maintain, and increasing pressure from northern tribes demanded constant vigilance. Economic inequality deepened. Villas and towns flourished, but rural poverty persisted. The century that followed would test the strength of this provincial peace. As imperial power began to wane across Europe, Britain's stability would falter under new challenges: rebellion, invasion, and economic crisis. For now, though, between 150 and 250 AD, Roman Britain stood at its zenith, a thriving, orderly province at the edge of the known world, where Roman civilization had taken firm root in foreign soil. By the mid-3rd century, the Roman province of Britannia had stood for more than 200 years. Its cities, roads, and villas stretched from the southern coast to the northern frontier, bound together under the imperial system. Yet by 250 AD, the wider Roman world was convulsed by a period modern historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a century defined by economic instability, political fragmentation, barbarian incursions, and the repeated collapse of imperial authority. Britannia, once a remote but loyal province, was not immune. The crisis began as pressures accumulated on all sides of the empire. Emperors rose and fell in quick succession, often meeting violent deaths. Between 235 and 284 AD, nearly 30 emperors ruled, many for only a short time. Civil wars erupted as legions proclaimed their generals emperor. The stability that had characterized the High Empire under the Antonines disintegrated. Trade declined, coinage was debased, and frontiers across the Rhine and Danube came under renewed assault. Britannia's distance from Rome had once shielded it from such upheaval, but as imperial control faltered, so did confidence among the island's governors and troops. The withdrawal of imperial attention left the northern frontier exposed. Beyond Hadrian's Wall, the Picts, a confederation of tribes from what is now Scotland, began raiding across the borderlands. Along the eastern and southern coasts, Germanic raiders, Saxons, Franks, and others began attacking by sea. exploiting the weakening naval defenses of the Channel. The provincial economy suffered under the strain. The silver content of Roman coins dropped sharply, causing inflation. Local minting centers, such as the one at Londinium, attempted to maintain circulation, but the purchasing power of currency eroded. Villas that had flourished in earlier centuries entered decline, their mosaics left unfinished or their agricultural estates abandoned. Urban life contracted, and evidence of maintenance in public baths and forums began to disappear from the archaeological record. Despite these hardships, Britannia remained strategically valuable. Its mineral resources, especially lead, tin, and iron, continued to feed the empire's needs. Grain production in the fertile south supplied garrisons stationed along Hadrian's Wall. Yet the military situation was becoming increasingly precarious. Around 259 AD, a Roman naval officer named Postumus established what became known as the Gallic Empire, a breakaway state encompassing Gaul, Spain, and briefly Britannia. This secession reflected the empire's fragmentation, regional commanders asserting independence in the face of central collapse. The Gallic Empire lasted for nearly 15 years, governed as a parallel Roman authority with its own emperors, coinage, and administration. For much of this period, Britannia remained aligned with Postumus and his successors, maintaining relative stability while the core empire reeled. The Gallic Empire's collapse in 274 under Emperor Aurelian brought Britannia back under direct Roman rule, but the return of imperial oversight did not restore prosperity. Invasions from across the sea increased, forcing new defensive measures. The Romans began constructing fortified shore bases, a system later known as the Saxon shore forts. Sites like Portchester, Richborough, Dover, and Pevensey were strengthened, their massive stone walls and towers designed to repel seaborne raiders. The Count of the Saxon shore would later become a key official responsible for these defenses, indicating the seriousness of the threat. By 286 AD, discontent again rose among Britain's military and naval commanders. One such officer, Carausius, a Menapian of northern origin, was tasked with protecting the Channel from piracy. Accused of corruption and embezzlement, he declared himself emperor and seized control of Britain and parts of northern Gaul. For 7 years, Carausius ruled as a usurper, effectively creating an independent Roman kingdom. Under Carausius, Britannia experienced a brief resurgence. His coinage emphasized Roman virtues, pax, felicitas, and libertas, suggesting he sought legitimacy rather than outright rebellion. He repaired forts, maintained the loyalty of the legions, and fostered a sense of provincial pride. His propaganda even claimed that he was the restorer of Britain, positioning himself as a protector of Roman civilization in the face of imperial neglect. In 293 AD, Emperor Diocletian, determined to restore order across the empire, dispatched his junior emperor, Constantius Chlorus, to reclaim the island. Carausius was assassinated by his subordinate, Electus, before the invasion could be completed. 3 years later, Constantius launched a coordinated assault. His fleet crossed the Channel, defeated Electus near Caliva Atrebatum, modern Silchester, and re-established Roman authority in 296 AD. This victory marked the beginning of a new, more structured imperial order. Diocletian introduced sweeping reforms designed to stabilize the empire. He divided it into smaller administrative units, the dioceses, and created the tetrarchy, a system of 4 rulers intended to prevent civil war. Britannia was reorganized into multiple provinces, collectively known as the Dioceses of the Britons. This division improved governance and taxation, ensuring closer supervision of local affairs. Economic recovery followed. Constantius rebuilt key cities and ports, including Londinium, which had suffered during Carausius's rebellion. The mint at Londinium resumed production of stable coinage. Trade across the Channel revived, linking Britain once again to the continental economy. Villas in the south, particularly in Sussex and Hampshire, began to show signs of renewed prosperity, with fresh mosaics and bathhouses indicating wealth among local elites. The army, too, was strengthened. Garrisons were reinforced, new fortifications were added, and the navy patrolled the coasts with greater regularity. Hadrian's Wall was repaired, symbolizing Rome's continuing commitment to defend the island. Yet these reforms only masked deeper structural issues. The empire was still overstretched, its resources divided between too many frontiers. The new administrative complexity also came with heavier taxation, straining the rural population. Inscriptions from this period occasionally hint at local unrest, and by the early 4th century, small-scale revolts reappeared. Despite the political turbulence, Roman culture in Britain continued to evolve. Christianity began to spread quietly through the towns and garrisons, aided by trade links and visiting merchants from Gaul. Archaeological finds, such as the Chi symbol in late Roman mosaics and the remains of early Christian burial sites, attest to this transformation. While pagan temples remained active, a gradual spiritual shift was underway. By 306 AD, the empire faced yet another succession crisis. Constantius Chlorus, now serving as Caesar of the West, died in Eboracum, modern York, during a campaign against northern tribes. His son, Constantine, was proclaimed emperor by the legions stationed there, and legalizing Christianity, a development that would profoundly shape the final century of Roman Britain. During Constantine's reign, 306 to 337 AD, Britain remained relatively peaceful and productive. His tolerance of Christianity encouraged the construction of early churches. Administrative continuity endured, and the island contributed troops and taxes to the empire's wars. Coins and inscriptions from this era suggest an enduring sense of belonging to the imperial system. But beneath the surface, the old pressures persisted. Barbarian raids never entirely ceased, and the economy remained fragile. By the mid-4th century, under Constantine's successors, the empire began once again to fragment. The reforms of Diocletian and Constantine had extended its life, but they could not halt the gradual decay. By around 350 AD, the signs of renewed instability were clear. Usurpers like Magnentius rose in the west, and imperial forces shifted back and forth between civil wars and frontier defense. For Britannia, these struggles meant a slow erosion of imperial presence. Garrisons were stretched thin, coastal defenses were under constant strain. Roman Britain was entering its final century, one that would see the gradual withdrawal of Rome's armies and the eventual collapse of its institutions. The long experiment of Roman rule on this distant island had endured crisis and renewal, rebellion and reform. Yet as the 4th century deepened, the foundations of empire began to falter once more, setting the stage for the end of Roman Britain itself. By the middle of the 4th century, Roman Britain had stood for almost 300 years. Its cities, villas, roads, and legions had long seemed permanent features of the landscape. Yet beneath the veneer of order, the empire that sustained the province was eroding. Between 350 and 410 AD, Roman Britain entered its final phase, a century of military strain, administrative collapse, and gradual isolation from the imperial core. The first signs of decline emerged during the reign of Constantius II, 337 to 361 AD, when the western provinces faced renewed instability. In 350, the general Magnentius usurped imperial power in Gaul, plunging the Western Empire into civil war. Britain's garrisons were drawn into the conflict, forced to support or resist the claimant depending on allegiance. When Magnentius was defeated at the Battle of Mursa Major in 351, imperial retribution fell hard. Britain's defenses were weakened by troop movements, leaving its coasts and borders vulnerable. In 360, a coordinated assault struck the island from multiple directions. Roman historians record the so-called Great Conspiracy, a devastating series of invasions by Picts from the north, Scots and Atticati from Ireland, and Saxons from across the North Sea. Simultaneously, some of the province's own troops mutinied. The attackers penetrated deep into Roman territory, sacking towns and disrupting trade. Communications with Gaul were severed, and for a time, central authority collapsed. The Emperor Julian dispatched his general, Theodosius the Elder, to restore order in 368 AD. Landing with reinforcements, Theodosius reoccupied key towns, drove back the invaders, and rebuilt fortifications. He reorganized the defense system, dividing military command between the Dux Britanniarum, commander of the northern frontier, and the Comes Latoris Saxonici, commander of the Saxon shore. This dual structure reflected the need for simultaneous defense against land and sea threats. Theodosius also implemented administrative reforms. Cities that had suffered decline, such as Londinium and Verulamium, were re-established as functioning centers of government. His campaign temporarily stabilized the island. By 370 AD, Roman Britain was again under control, its cities operating, and its legions guarding the frontiers. Yet this recovery was fragile, dependent on a Roman state that was itself disintegrating. The empire's internal divisions worsened in the late 4th century. After the death of Emperor Theodosius I in 395, the empire was permanently split into eastern and western halves. The Western Roman Empire, which governed Britain, was overburdened by wars on multiple fronts: Visigoths in the Balkans, Vandals in Spain, and internal power struggles in Italy. Each crisis drained manpower and resources that might otherwise have reinforced the distant province of Britain. By the 380s, economic vitality was waning. Many villa estates in the countryside were abandoned or repurposed for defensive use. Coin circulation declined sharply after 402 AD, suggesting that imperial mints had ceased regular supply. Archaeological evidence shows a contraction of trade. Imported goods from Gaul and the Mediterranean grew scarce, and local pottery replaced once common continental wares. Christianity, meanwhile, became increasingly prominent. The Edict of Thessalonica in 380 had made Nicene Christianity the official religion of the empire, and by the final decades of Roman Britain, it had spread widely. Archaeological finds at sites like Lullingstone Villa reveal private chapels with Christian symbols. Bishops from Britain are recorded attending continental councils, such as the Council of Alls in 314 and the Council of Rimini in 359. Pagan temples fell into disuse, or were converted into churches. The social structure of the province shifted as well. The old Roman urban elite, the curiales, were burdened by taxes and administrative responsibilities. Many abandoned civic offices or retreated to rural estates. Power became increasingly localized, passing into the hands of military commanders and landowners who could protect their own territories. By 383 AD, another major rupture occurred. The commander of Roman troops in Britain, Magnus Maximus, was proclaimed emperor by his legions. Crossing to Gaul with much of Britain's field army, he seized control of the western provinces and ruled from Trier. For nearly 5 years, he governed as a rival emperor before being defeated and executed by Theodosius I in 388. His departure stripped Britain of a large portion of its defensive forces, a loss from which it never fully recovered. Raids from the north and sea resumed soon after. The remaining Roman garrisons were stretched thin along the wall and coasts. In 401 AD, the situation worsened when the Visigoths, led by Alaric, invaded Italy. The Western Emperor Honorius recalled troops from outlying provinces, including Britain, to defend the heartland. Although some soldiers may have remained, the professional backbone of the army was gone. Without strong imperial oversight, local leaders began assuming authority. Romano-British officials continued to maintain order, collect taxes, and manage defenses, but they did so without direct imperial direction. The central government in Ravenna, besieged by internal crises, could offer little support. In 406 AD, a new disaster struck the empire. On the last day of that year, a coalition of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi crossed the frozen Rhine, overrunning Gaul. Roman control of the continent disintegrated. Cut off from supply and communication, Britain was effectively isolated. In 407, the remaining troops in the province proclaimed a soldier named Constantine III as emperor, hoping he would restore stability. Constantine crossed into Gaul, establishing his base at Arles, but he soon became embroiled in continental warfare and could not return. His rebellion further drained Britain of soldiers. By 410, even the appearance of Roman authority had vanished. That same year, a delegation of British cities appealed to Emperor Honorius for help against barbarian attacks. His reply, recorded by the historian Zosimus, was stark. He instructed the Britons to look to their own defenses. This brief line marks the symbolic end of Roman rule in Britain. With no legions to protect them, local communities turned inward. Fortified hilltops, reminiscent of the pre-Roman Iron Age, were reoccupied. Roman towns, once vibrant centers of administration and trade, were abandoned or transformed into small fortified enclaves. Roads fell into disrepair, and the minting of coins ceased entirely. Culturally, however, the legacy of Rome endured. Latin remained the language of administration and religion among the educated elite. Christianity continued to spread, preserved by local bishops and clergy. The material culture of late Roman Britain, pottery styles, building techniques, and agricultural systems, persisted for several generations. Archaeological layers from the early 5th century reveal a landscape in transition. In towns like Verulamium and Cirencesta, wooden huts replaced stone houses. At Wroxeter, portions of the old Roman baths were converted into workshops and dwellings, suggesting adaptation rather than total collapse. The withdrawal of Rome did not mean the immediate disappearance of Roman civilization. For several decades, Romano-British leaders, perhaps local magistrates or former military officers, maintained fragments of Roman governance. Some scholars have identified these men with later legends of British kings who resisted the Saxons. Yet by the mid-5th century, new groups from across the sea, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, began to settle in the east and south. The Roman world in Britain gave way to a new age. The final years of Roman Britain thus represent both an end and a transformation. The empire's formal structures collapsed, but its influence endured in language, religion, and infrastructure. Roads, cities, and walls remained as silent witnesses to centuries of Roman presence. By 410 AD, the island that Julius Caesar had first glimpsed nearly 5 centuries earlier was no longer part of the empire. What Rome had built, the towns, the villas, the baths, the order of law, now stood as relics of a vanished age. Yet the memory of Roman Britain would echo through the centuries, shaping the identity and imagination of the peoples who came after. When the Roman Empire finally withdrew from Britain around 410 AD, the departure was not marked by a single dramatic event, but rather by the slow unwinding of imperial presence. Garrisons had already vanished, governors were no longer appointed, and imperial edicts no longer reached the island. The Britons, left to their own devices, entered a new and uncertain age. Without maintenance, aqueducts crumbled, roads deteriorated, and trade networks disintegrated. Yet the physical imprint of Rome remained everywhere. Its roads still guided movement, its walls offered protection, and its villas stood as visible reminders of an imperial past. Some regions adapted more successfully than others. In the West, particularly in Wales and the Southwest, Romano-British aristocrats maintained elements of Roman governance. In his work De Excidio et Conquesta Britanniae, he describes a land torn by internal strife and invasion. According to him, after the Romans left, the Britons initially managed their own defenses but soon fell into civil conflict. Facing repeated raids from the north and west, they invited Saxon mercenaries to aid them. These mercenaries, once settled, turned against their hosts, beginning the process that would eventually lead to the Anglo-Saxon domination of lowland Britain. The Christian faith, introduced under imperial rule, survived the collapse of the state and became one of the unifying forces of post-Roman society. British bishops maintained contact with the Christian world of Gaul, and later, missionaries from Ireland and Rome would rekindle the faith among the Anglo-Saxons. Politically, the 5th century was an age of fragmentation. Regional rulers emerged, many claiming descent from Roman officials. Saxon and Jutish settlers from across the North Sea began arriving in greater numbers by the mid-5th century. Initially employed as allies, they soon carved out their own territories, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex among them. Roman towns in these regions were abandoned or repurposed. The arrival of these Germanic peoples marked the beginning of a new cultural and linguistic era, the birth of Anglo-Saxon England. Still, even as new powers rose, the Roman imprint endured in memory. Medieval chroniclers such as Bede and Nennius viewed the Roman period as a golden age of law and civilization. Legends of great leaders, most famously King Arthur, may reflect dim memories of late Roman warlords who resisted Saxon advance. Sites like Caerleon and Chester, once legionary fortresses, were later associated with Arthurian lore. The continuity of settlement in these areas suggests that post-Roman leaders consciously maintained the prestige of Roman centers.